I'd like to call us to order here. Welcome back, those of you who were here for the first panel, a very rich panel on martyrdom in Judaism and Christianity, and we're going to transition now and look at the third of the Abrahamic faiths, Islam. And so again, I just encourage you to keep in mind some of the questions that were raised during the first panel, because while there's distinctness to the various traditions, I think there's also some resonance. So without further ado, I would like to welcome David Cook to speak to us on martyrdom in Islam.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It might come as something of a shock for some of you to hear my initial conclusion is that martyrdom in Islam is not a particularly important theme within the religion overall. This is not some conclusion that you might necessarily come to if you're looking at today's news, but it is one that I would come to as looking at the religion in its historical patterns as well as its present-day realities. Starting from the period of the Quran, the Muslim community, for the most part, has not faced martyrdom in the same way that Christians and Jews did. Other than the most initial period of Muslim history, during the course of which Muslims were persecuted by the pagans of Mecca, and did suffer some martyrs, which, in honor of you, Elizabeth, I'll mention that the first Muslim martyr was actually a woman, which is very rarely known. But I couldn't resist bringing that up in light of what you said about Saint whatever her name is, Perpetua. Give me Arabic names, not Latin names. But during this initial period, you do find some martyrs and some suffering of Muslims that is in an entirely passive manner, in the same way that you do with regard to Christians and Jews. But primarily, the development of martyrdom that has been especially true of Sunni Islam has been more of an active type of martyrdom, and especially stems from the second part of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, which is from the area of Medina, when the Muslim community was being established as an actual community. And most of that martyrdom is of an active nature. In other words, martyrs would be primarily fighting, and they would gain martyrdom through their death in battle. Now, this is only very limitedly mentioned inside the Quran. There's a few verses that have become central for the development of martyrology inside the Quran, the most important of which is from Surah 3, 169 through 70, which says, "Do not think of those who have died in the way of Allah, in the way of God," which generally inside the Quran means jihad, "as being dead, but rather they are alive with their Lord, being well provided for." Now, the problem with the Quranic Martyrology is the fact that it doesn't strongly differentiate between those who have died as martyrs and other Muslims. Nor is there really very much of a specific reward attached to these people that is given inside the Quran. And so we really have to wait until the period of the Great Muslim Conquest, which lasts between 634 and approximately the 740s, for there to be the development of an actual Muslim martyrology, including the most common word, the word shaheed, meaning martyr or witness, which is so closely related to its Christian counterparts, martyrios. But during that particular time, then we begin to see the development of a Muslim martyrology that rapidly expands, and it has really never ceased to expand. It's during that period that we find that martyrology, that the idea of some sort of special reward given to martyrs becomes not only focused upon those people who die in battle, but also upon a number of different other categories. And by the 16th century, we find that there are approximately 50 to 54 different categories of people that could possibly be categorized as martyrs. Now, some of those are fairly obvious or closely, or at least topically connected to dying in battle. For example, from a very early period, we find that those people who die in the plague are actually considered to be martyrs. This sort of martyrology would obviously have some hygienic aspect to it, that you would die rather than, let's say, fleeing a plague area and perpetrating the plague. But there's a vast quantity of other different types of martyrs. For example, those people who die in shipwrecks, those people who die in burning buildings, people who die of stomach complaints, people women who die in childbirth, for example, and a vast quantity of other types of martyrs. And so within Islam, there never really comes to be a hard and fast definition of what constitutes exactly a martyr. In general, the focus is always upon those people who die in battle, or those people who die passively for Islam, but that second category is comparatively small. For the most part, the Muslim community has never really faced the situation where people have been forced, in the same sense as Christians or Jews were, to decide between their faith and actual death. For the most part, Muslims lived inside the Muslim world, and if they were killed for being Muslim, it was generally by other Muslims, rather than, let's say, by non-Muslims. Now, that's most especially true with regard to Shiites. Shiism, as a belief system, is definitely far and away more martyrologically developed than Sunnism. Sunnism is very closely tied with the actual dominant governing form of Islam and has rarely had to face a point where it was actually in the minority. Shiites, however, who believed that the rights of the Prophet's family to take power were paramount, especially during the first 3 centuries of Islam, basically were continually persecuted. And it's really from that time that we find a huge number of martyrologies that detail the sufferings of the Prophet's family. The most prominent of those is known as Maqatal al-Talabiyin, which lists off 189 members of the Prophet Muhammad's family that were murdered, and oftentimes details their sufferings in various different gruesome ways. So Shiites basically had the historical experience of constantly being persecuted. Now, the paradigmatic Shiite martyr is the Prophet's grandson, al-Hussein, who was martyred in 680 when he attempted to coalesce a political or religious movement around himself in southern Iraq, was betrayed by the people of southern Iraq, and ultimately led to his death then at Karbala, which is still commemorated by the Shiite community as being one of their foundational memories even to this day. So the sufferings of Hussein are extremely widely circulated, and even among Sunnis today, he is seen as being something of a paradigmatic martyr. There's very few Sunnis, for example, that would associate today with his killers anymore, even though they were basically the ancestors of the Sunni community. And so his martyrdom is far and away the one that's the most popular from classical Islam. But as I say, there's quite a wide range of other different types of martyrdoms that you can find. Now, the Sunni legal literature is concentrated to a large degree on the definitions concerning the fighting martyr. And so primarily that's what I'm going to be talking about during this particular talk. And they focused upon the issue about where is the boundary line between a fighting martyr who displays some sort of bravery or some sort of maybe what we would even call suicidal bravery in battle, and one who actually commits suicide. Since suicide is strongly prohibited actually inside the Quran and also inside the traditional literature, it's very important for these types of legal definitions to make sure to place these fighters outside the boundaries of suicide. And so they established the certain category, the certain legal type of category, which is known as the single fighter who charges a larger number, or in some cases, a hopelessly larger number. In other words, somebody who is going to almost certainly die, but not necessarily by his own hand. Now, this particular person, in general, is considered to be a martyr, but there are certain circumstances that are laid down for him in the classical legal literature, that there must be some particular point to his charge. In other words, it has to actually give some sort of sense of terror to the enemy. It has to be part of a building block, let's say, of a larger victorious strategy. In other words, it can't simply be a hopeless charge merely for the sake of being a hopeless charge, let's say like the charge of the Light Brigade or something along those lines. So the legal literature in general in the classical period was very careful to lay down these sort of rules for fighters. Now, they also considered the question of who could possibly, let's say, seek out martyrdom. Now, this discussion leads us to the ancestor of today's suicide attacks. Suicide attacks in classical legal literature are comparatively rarely discussed. By suicide attacks here, I mean actual suicide attacks in which the person has to actually die in order to carry out a particular mission. Now, as part of an excursus for my work, I've dealt with some of the theses of Robert Pape, who is so popular today, in his book, Dying to Win, which some of you might be familiar with. And in that book, he tries to analyze what are some of the ancestors, some of the historical ancestors of suicide attackers. And he latches upon the figures of the Ismaili assassins, who were popular for about 100 years after their paradigmatic assassination in 1092 of the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. And he makes the claim that these particular assassins basically were on suicidal missions and therefore were the ancestors of suicides. I do not accept this particular claim. I feel, as a matter of fact, as I say, with this excursus to study these assassins, I've discovered that actually most of the assassins made at least some sort of attempt to escape after their particular assassination. So there doesn't seem to have been very much of a tendency, even within this most radical sect of Islam, to actually die for a particular assassination. The 15th century jihad writer Ibn Nahas, who wrote what is far and away the largest jihad book that was ever written in the classical period, actually over a particular section, after dealing with the category of the single fighter, does discuss actual suicide attacks. And he comes to the conclusion that there's no real benefit in them, and that although they would conceivably be accepted as martyrdom, he can't conceive of any real reason why on earth anybody would want to go that direction. And for the most part, I actually concur with him. I think that before the development of explosives, it's really hard to visualize what precisely a suicide attacker would actually gain from attacking that a normal fighter wouldn't. And so it's really something that you have to look to the modern period in order to find some sort of justifications for suicide attackers. Starting in the 1980s, you begin to find the phenomenon of suicide attackers within Islam. They do have antecedents such as the Japanese kamikazes and different others, the Tamil Tigers and so forth. And you first find them with regard to the Hezbollah in their war against Israel in the area of southern Lebanon. It's very interesting that there's very little legal discussion about this type of tactic that you find in the Hezbollah literature. It's seen as part and parcel of all the different other tactics that Hezbollah used at that particular time, and not separated out as something phenomenal or even particularly useful. Hezbollah basically abandoned the tactic after the late 1980s. And I feel like the most probable reason for that is simply that suicide attacks are essentially not very useful against an army, as we can see against the American army in Iraq today. But starting from 1994, suicide attacks jumped over into the Palestinians, and then gradually made a leap into those globalist radical Muslims, such as Al-Qaeda and its many ideological offshoots, that sought to use suicide attacks in order to equalize what they considered to be an unequal struggle, usually against the United States or some other different country, Israel, Russia, India, many others. Now, from 1997, we start to find the first justifications of suicide attacks within Sunni Islam. And it's interesting to note the fact that, that with Hezbollah, suicide attacks were actually called suicide attacks in Arabic. But when they start to appear among Sunnis, they begin to be called martyrdom operations. And I very strongly feel like that the reason for that is that within Sunnism, there was actually some ideological problem that had to be covered over in order for these types of attacks to be accepted within the broader community. Now, until now, we've only begun to see the actual depth of opposition to suicide attacks within the Muslim world. But from an intellectual point of view, intellectual and religious point of view, the case for them is comparatively weak within Sunnism. And it's my judgment that, as I say, that they had to be purified to some extent in order to cover up that fact. In general, from 1997, we find that, not surprisingly, they are analyzed and presented in terms of that category of the single fighter that charges a larger number. There's also an attempt to find different historical antecedents within the tradition literature in order to support the case for suicide attacks. Within Sunnism, it's impossible to find something that will be accepted within the religious culture that doesn't have a strong antecedent within the prophet's life. Now, there's a few examples of that they've been able to dredge up. Different figures, mainly taken actually and supremely ironically from the Christian martyrological tradition that has gotten Islamized. Most especially the story of the Christian martyrs of Najran, who are a group of Christians that were martyred for their faith in the area of Najran, which is today in northern Yemen, southern Saudi Arabia, and at least according to the accounts, were either crucified, burnt, drugged to their deaths in various different gruesome ways that are listed all in the literature. At any rate, some of the stories of their martyrologies actually did pass into the Hadith literature, the tradition literature, and today are used actually as proof texts for suicide attackers. Now, the important point that contemporary Sunni radicals had to establish was what is the spiritual status of the person who makes a suicide attack. So it's extremely important for them to isolate this not as suicide, but as being defined by the intent of the person. In other words, if the intent of the fighter, the one who commits a suicide attack, was actually to promote Islam, to wage a noble jihad, and so forth, then it would be accepted actually as a martyrdom. And so it's on this most flimsy of evidence, which can never actually be ascertained because the person would be dead, that actually suicide attacks have been accepted. Now, there are 3 points usually brought up in opposition to suicide attacks by different prominent Muslim ulama that have attacked it. The first one is simply that these suicide attacks are really nothing more than suicide. And for a number of them, that really pretty much finishes off the argument. The second one is that they destroy or defame Islam, and that they most certainly do. So there's a certain amount of tactical opposition to them, usually centering around the idea that they kill women and children, or Muslims, or innocents, and so forth, which they most certainly do. So after every prominent operation that you find, let's say so like September 11th, or the Bali suicide attacks, or the London attacks of 2 years ago, you will find various different refutations that will be put out by radical Muslims designed to essentially get around that issue, or to somehow or another defend themselves against the charge that they've killed innocent people. The third point that's usually brought up against them is the idea of fame. And this comes back down to a couple of verses inside the Quran which talk about jihad as being an anonymous spiritual activity whose reward is only going to be dispensed by God. And that if somebody necessarily is fighting for fame or some sort of otherworldly benefit, then their martyrdom actually is tainted in some way or another. And so, some have actually attacked the idea of suicide attacks on that ground, saying that that with the internet, with the type of martyrologies that you find by the fistful on the internet, there's no way for a contemporary martyr to actually avoid, even if they would want to, the reception of some sort of fame for their things. So I think that the issue of the opposition to suicide attacks is something that is yet to be fully developed, but I think that it's gradually growing within the Muslim community, especially with the huge number of suicide attacks, at least up to 890 that have taken place in Iraq, that has killed so many different people, but also in many other places. Now, the issue of the rewards for martyrdom is something that is only gradually alluded to inside the Quran. As you might have guessed from that initial verse, the reward that's listed right there is fairly nebulous. It just simply says that the martyr will be with God and will be well provided for. In general, there's 6 particular rewards that are associated with the martyr that are usually said not to be given to any other Muslim. So it says, from a tradition, it says, in the sight of God, the martyr has 6 unique qualities. God forgives him at the first opportunity and shows him his place in paradise. He is saved from the torment of the grave. He is saved from the great fright at the time of the resurrection. A crown of honor is placed upon his head, 1 ruby of which is better than the world and all that is in it. He is married to 72 of the Houris, the women of paradise, and he gains the right to intercede for 70 of his relatives. And so, with traditions like this, you do find some sort of special single rewards for the martyr that are unlike anything else, let's say, that a normal Muslim dying would receive. But that's still, one cannot say from the classical period or from the modern period that there's any particular process by which it's established that someone is a martyr. In general, the categories simply are if there's a broad consensus of a particular population, group, sect, and sometimes country, that a particular person is a martyr, then they're a martyr. But this is fairly subjective, and really most of the time the audiences will simply say, well, this person is a martyr if God wishes, and therefore we'll just kind of leave it up to God to decide. Now, inside Islam, there's an important category that I've skipped over, which is the Martyrs of Love. Paul is going to be developing this quite a good deal more, but I'll just allude to it briefly. That there's a tradition that says that if someone who loves truly and is chaste and who dies in that state then is considered to be a martyr. And so this has opened up actually a whole range of martyrdoms, what are known as the Martyrs of Love. There are, for the most part, those lovers, something along the lines of Romeo and Juliet, that are said, they're grouped together. In several of the books, there's about 150 of them. Many of them are couplets, but many of them are single, who loved some particular person hopelessly, chastely, and oftentimes committed suicide as a result of the rejection of their love. So it's a very interesting category that's opened up a whole plethora of literary development inside Islam, again, very closely akin to the stories about Romeo and Juliet. But we don't find these types of martyrs of love being lionized today. As a matter of fact, it's very difficult to find any mention of these types of literary martyrs being categorized as martyrs in any contemporary literature. So martyrdom between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam needs to be categorized. Within Sunni Islam, we find that martyrdom is very closely tied to a sense of victory. Usually the standard comment about it is that you gain one of the two greatest things, martyrdom or victory, when you're in a battlefield situation. And so for Sunnis, there's very little tendency to keep large martyrologies. Usually the people that are lionized in this manner are fighters that are remembered by a particular population, usually on the borders of Islam, let's say like India or Africa, or sometimes in Indonesia or in some of the Central Asian countries and so forth. But there's no sense of any grief that's associated with the martyr. The martyr's body is considered to be holy in and of itself. Okay, it's treated in a completely different manner than other Muslims are. Muslims, after their death, are usually washed and prepared very carefully for their burial. But martyrs are put deliberately in the clothing in which they fell. They are not washed and placed directly into the grave. The usual interpretation of that is that gore, the blood, and so forth, the wounds that are on the body of the martyr are themselves a purifying aspect that needs to be rather preserved than actually washed away. And so then those wounds, that blood and so forth, then will be a sign for God actually at the day of resurrection. Now, in contradistinction to that, the Shiite martyrdom tradition is very much a passive one. For the most part, Sunnis died fighting outsiders, people who were clearly outside the community, clearly non-Muslims and so forth. But for the most part, Shiites actually died or were killed by other Muslims, usually Sunnis. And so the strong sense of the Shiite martyrological narrative is one of grief, one of passivity. It has close affinities with Christianity, with Christian martyrdoms. And so for Shiites, we find this, that the remembrance of the martyrs is really part of the community coalescing process. And as I say, I think it has a lot of different affinities with early Christian self-definition, placing of the oppressor as the other, and so forth, that Elizabeth already alluded to them. Now, I'd like to conclude with simply some comments about the status and categorization of martyrs. The fact is that the word martyr inside Islamic cultures has become extremely broad. Today, we find it being bestowed upon a wide range of people, not all of whom die even a violent death. For example, you can find Yasser Arafat being listed as a martyr. and literally being called a shaheed, or other different figures who did not die in the field of battle, but are given the title of martyr simply as kind of what we might say is an assessment of their life's work, rather than actually signifying the very last moments of their existence. And so, and you even find from the nationalist phase of recent history that even non-Muslims, sometimes Christians, sometimes those who are socialists or atheists and so forth, have been granted the title of, let's say, martyr. And so the term martyr has become extremely broad. Within the recent past, there's definitely an attempt by radical Muslims to sort of wrest that breadth away from the rest of Muslims or non-Muslims in the Muslim world, and focus it much more upon its Islamic affinities, and to bring out those Islamic affinities to make sure that those things are present. And those things include things like dreams, miracles, focusing upon the purity of the body. We find kind of this sort of an adoption of a Christian attitude that the body of the martyr continues to be whole and pure and give off a sweet smell even long after their death. And oftentimes there's different miracles that are associated with that personality. They appear in dreams, visions. They're sort of a conduit for God in this world. And so ultimately, the way I see martyrdom has to do with sort of a part of an authority process that's happening today in Sunni and Shiite Islam, and is yet to be seen which direction that's going to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that detailed overview of the complexity of the discourse of martyrdom in Islam, something that we don't always hear or see in the usual public presentations of these questions. So David's book is really the key work on martyrdom in Islam, so I would encourage you all to have a look at it. It's really got an extraordinary breadth in its treatment of the subject. I would like to just add some footnotes, as it were, to David's presentation, and I'm going to step onto thin ice. It's a story of my life in many ways. Maybe I'm seeking to be a martyr, but in any event, I want to speak a little bit about false martyrs. Now, I'm in no position to define a true or false martyr. This point was made earlier. We academics aren't religious authorities. But we can follow the community's own logic in terms of what the community rejects as martyrdom. And so I'd like to just present some examples of that. First of all, though, I want to start with a story, a hadith that tells the tale of a man who committed adultery. Fearful of incurring an unfavorable status in the next world for his sin in this one, he goes to the Prophet and asks the Prophet to apply the Sharia punishment for adultery, namely death by stoning, as a way to compensate for his wrongdoing. The Prophet sends him away, telling him to seek God's forgiveness. But the man keeps coming back, insisting that only by submitting to the prescribed punishment will he be restored to favor with God, to enter the next world with a clean slate. The Prophet finally relents and orders him to be stoned, but not without proclaiming that this man's repentance was so great that it could encompass the Muslim community entire. That is, compensate for its collective moral failings and not only his own individual ones. What is the message here? Some highlight the possibility of God's forgiveness, which the adulterer here chose not to seek, preferring death on account of his fear of God, whose law he had disobeyed. Others emphasize the Prophet's proclamation that this man's repentance could serve as a kind of communal atonement. His actively sought death as a form of repentance becomes a model, potentially to be imitated. One's death as a way to atone for a Muslim community whose standing before God is felt to be in jeopardy on account of its sinfulness, its moral waywardness, its preference for the ways of this world over obedience to God. So what I'd like to consider is the idea of martyrdom as a means of atonement, compensation for communal sinfulness, or the perception of such sinfulness. That is, the failure to maintain religion in pure form, untarnished by worldliness. Does Islam accept the idea that one person or a group of persons might die as a way to shield the community from the divine wrath to be expected for violating what are known as the rights of God? How to compensate for disobedience? By fighting unbelievers and apostates along with imperfect believers who threaten the purity of God's religion? Or by offering willing victims as martyrs to demonstrate to God and to others that some, at least, are still wholly committed, that the religion is still worth something? How to demonstrate to God that the believing community is not wholly resigned to a less than perfect expression of religion? Does Islam see the sacrificial or self-sacrificial victim as a valid means of expiating for sinfulness? One person, a group of persons, offering up their lives on behalf of the honor of the religion? Or does Islam look to other means short of martyrdom to expiate for sinfulness, both individual and collective? First, it is necessary to distinguish between Sunnism and Shiism, and David has done that. And I just want to add that Shiism does recognize the redemptive suffering, even unto death, of a special group of persons: the house of the Prophet, the Imams in general, and Hussein in particular. The story of Hussein's martyrdom in Karbala in the year 680 is key to the way the Shia community understands itself to be reconciled to God. For Shiism, history got derailed from the course God had intended for it, above all by the evil Umayyads who persecuted the Imams and stained Islam by their worldly ways. The martyrdom of Hussein thus serves a vital role in the ritual life of the Shia community. That is, as part of the religious ceremonies whereby the community renews its commitment to God, notably the Passion plays during the Feast of Ashura. In this sense, in Shiism, martyrdom, death as the will of God, has been tamed, as it were, that is, made part of the community's beliefs and rituals and not its politics per se. This is not to overlook the fact that in recent decades, Hussein's martyrdom has taken on tremendous political, indeed revolutionary significance as a symbol of resistance to the so-called tyrants of the world. And you see this in Khomeini's Iran and Hezbollah, so on and so forth. Rather, what I mean to say in general is that Hussein's martyrdom has acted as a ritual vehicle of atonement, a means for the moral renewal of the Shia community. Does this exist in Sunnism? Death as a means of restoring the integrity of religion. Where does Sunnism locate taqwa? Taqwa. That is the piety which must exist somewhere within the community so as to shield it against divine wrath. Taqwa, meaning fear of God, is a Quranic term with significance for one standing in the other world. Loss of taqwa risks exposing Muslims to a frightful fate on Judgment Day. First of all, it should be asked, why does a community feel it has lost divine favor and is vulnerable to divine wrath? We don't have enough time to explore this question here. There may be specific political circumstances that encourage a community to feel it has failed religion and is out of God's favor. Communities, all communities, I would say, are periodically faced with challenges that raise questions about their commitment to their own values. Have they lived up to the teachings of religion? In Sunnism, I would argue, this anxiety periodically emerges, a sense of having lost its connection to its prophetic origins, that is, the piety needed to demonstrate its worth before God. Sunnism has sought multiple ways of regenerating taqwa. You can preach and you can teach. You can have an enhanced commitment to more ordinary rituals, such as prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, through which expiation for sinfulness, kafara ana zanub, can be imagined. To say nothing of communal trust in God's mercifulness. God can cover up people's sins. Also, animal sacrifice at the end of the Hajj. Animal sacrifice, but not human sacrifice, has also constituted an important means for the expiation of sin. At the same time, there have been individuals and groups in the past that have sought to generate taqwa through martyrdom actively sought, sometimes in suicidal and lethal fashion, that is, killing oneself and others. Such a death is meant to demonstrate to God that the community still has examples of perfect piety. People, like the earlier mentioned adulterer, who are willing to submit to the Sharia-ordained death penalty, to put themselves and potentially the whole community back in good standing with God. However, the wider Sunni community and its religious authorities have repeatedly rejected this notion of martyrdom. For Sunnism, the point is that the same goal, holiness, can be achieved by means other than death. This is hardly to suggest that martyrdom, even actively sought martyrdom, has no place in Sunnism, as David has shown. The possibility of martyrdom on the battlefield has been recognized as a strategy against the infidel enemy. Such martyrdom, if true, absolves the martyr of his own sin, but religious scholars have long underscored the impossibility of knowing the intention with which the Muslim fighter goes off to seek martyrdom in battle. He may be going wholeheartedly to struggle in the way of God, but he may be motivated by a worldly purpose lurking in his heart somewhere, such as fame and glory. And only God knows what lies in the hearts of men. The fact that the hypocrite who dies in battle for Islam is not awarded the martyr's crown demonstrates that the criterion for holiness is not death per se, but rather interior status of the soul. And so it would therefore be rash to declare that death of this sort truly embodies the piety of the kind necessary for effectively achieving atonement for the sins of the entire community. One simply can't know. To be sure, the martyr on the battlefield enjoys some ability to intercede for others, at least his relatives. That idea is there, but I would say is downplayed in the scholarly tradition. In Sunnism, remembering the martyr has never been a major part of the community's ritual life, and for good reason. It would take authority away from the religious scholars in favor of the religious martyrs. As the adage goes, the ink of the scholar is more precious than the blood of the martyr. It is the scholars, not the martyrs, who are heirs of the prophets. And this idea, I think, is being challenged. As David noted, there's a dialectic or discourse in Sunni Islam over religious authority. And I would say that Al-Qaeda, through martyrdom, is trying to use martyrdom to claim a certain authority to be the spokesman for the global ummah. So, I'd just like to briefly illustrate my point here with 3 examples. First of all, Hora Jism. Hora Jism is a movement in early Islam that actively sought death in battle against other Muslims. These other Muslims, the Kharijites claimed, had tarnished the purity of the revealed message by recognizing human leadership rather than the Book of God, Scripture alone, as exclusive leader of the Muslim community. Second, the mystic martyr, Hallaj, put to death in the year 922 for claiming to embody divine truth in his own person. And 3, Al-Qaeda, which has sought to claim legitimacy for its martyrdom operations by cloaking them in the language of communal atonement. The blood of the martyr spilt for the sake of reanimating a Muslim community deemed to have lost its religious integrity on account of its alliances with infidel and apostate powers. So first, Hora Jism. Hora Jism dramatizes the tension between the desire to preserve life and the desire not to violate God's clear commands. There's a complex discourse in Islam over the value of life, nafs, relative to religion, deen. How far can one go in compromising religion in order to preserve life? Can one eat pork if it will save one's life? Can one pretend not to be a Muslim to save one's skin? In its most extreme form, Hora Jism exaggerates this tension by denying any commonality between human life and religious ideals. Kharijites attacked other Muslims, men, women, and children, who acknowledged the authority of human leadership, which Hora Jism, again, held to be a violation of divine speech as unalterable source of Muslim rule. What's more, these Kharijites tied their own religious integrity to a willingness to die in battle against other Muslims who they believed had compromised the purity of Islam. Kharijites felt remorse for not dying in battle, as if continuing to live cast suspicion on one's faith, suggesting a preference for this world over the next one. And so, for the Kharijites, death becomes the highest expression of piety. And I think you see that also in early Christianity with the Donatists. The Kharijites actually called themselves vendors, shurat, that is, those who happily barter life in exchange for religion. The goal was to sell one's life in this world to purchase a favorable status in the next one. In the final analysis, Hora Jism was rejected by the Sunni community. Human existence, even if religiously imperfect, is not intrinsically at odds with God, with God's speech, as revealed through the Quran. This position first emerged with a group called the Murji'ah, whose refusal to condemn imperfect Muslims was accepted as orthodox by the wider Sunni community. Hora Jism, it was concluded, only served to foment civil strife and so defeated the public purposes of Islam, making it both a heresy and a crime. Second, Hallaj, who again was crucified in the year 922 for claiming to embody divine truth in his own person. He's one of the more fascinating figures of Islamic history. Many see him as a quack, but others have revered his memory, not so much, and this is important, for being crucified, but rather for modeling union with God, a piety where no barrier exists between self and God. So his act of self-sacrifice is remembered more as an example of spiritual union with God and not of communal atonement. Hallaj, for his part, was bent on achieving his own death for God. Why? He had attracted a fair number of followers with his mystical ideas, wonder-working miracles, and provocative challenges to religious and political authorities alike, but he felt the need to die. For him, his death was the ultimate means of witnessing to the divine presence that he claimed to embody in his person. The climax, as it were, of his aspiration to God, his death witnessing to the divine presence, which in turn would be made available to the community at large, ensuring its holiness. Now, Hallaj's goal, I would argue, made some sense in his day, even if his means of achieving it did not. Okay, and I think it's always important to kind of look at the martyrs in the context of the day and the anxieties, sometimes religious anxieties of the day. And the writings of the period overall suggest a certain anxiety about the religious status of the Muslim community, now wealthy and powerful, that is, very successful in a worldly sense. This can be seen, for example, in the writings of the 9th century ascetic Muhasabi. For him, the solution to the loss of holiness that such worldliness had brought about was not to be found in martyrdom, but rather in the perfection of taqwa piety in a select group of Muslims, saints, known in Arabic as the friends of God. Even if the community fell short of divine standards, the wrath of God could be avoided not by the death of a sacrificial victim, but by a saintly elite whose perfect piety would shield an imperfect community against the justice of God's wrath. Not the martyr's death, but the saint's holiness as means of compensating for the failure of religion. This understanding of the friends of God, the saints of Islam, would evolve into the idea of intercession. Saints who, because they were pleasing to God, could protect, that is, intercede for, a community that fell short of divine favor. Hallaj's martyrdom was thus bested by this emergent understanding of the friends of God as means by which the holiness of the community, that is, its standing in the divine presence, would be maintained. In contrast to what Hussein has come to mean for Shiism, Hallaj's death is not memorialized in ritual ceremony as a means for expiating sin to help the community draw closer to God. Finally, Al-Qaeda. A key point to note is that some, but by no means all, Sunni authorities have recognized martyrdom operations, that is, suicide attacks, as valid means for defending the territorial integrity of the abode of Islam under certain extraordinary conditions, perhaps as a last resort, for example. So there has been some authoritative support for martyrdom operations against the Israeli presence in the occupied territories and the U.S. presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. So here we have martyrdom, suicidal and lethal, that is, killing oneself and others as a strategy for a political purpose, namely repelling foreign forces occupying the abode of Islam, and not for a ritual purpose, that is, atonement for sin. So the suicide operations of Al-Qaeda, the problem is that they don't fit perfectly into this Sunni model, even where Sunni authorities have allowed for a certain legitimacy for suicide operations. The Al-Qaeda version still doesn't fit into this model. The Al-Qaeda version is about global jihad with no end. Its martyrdom operations go in too many directions. Sometimes they are deployed in defense of Muslim territorial interests. The word here is maslaha, but not always. Al-Qaeda, by attacking New York, London, Madrid, etc., sites outside the abode of Islam, has failed to stay within Sunni definitions of what serves Muslim interests. Indeed, Sunni authorities note that Al-Qaeda's activity only foments global strife and ends by harming Muslim interests in this world. What is noteworthy is the fact that Al-Qaeda, since it does not fit the Sunni model, tries to create a new Sunni model by cloaking its martyrdom operations in the language of communal atonement. This is not the place to go into the extended rhetoric of Al-Qaeda or spin-off versions of it, but it glorifies martyrdom, the blood of youth, as a means to restore the Muslim community to divine favor. Michael Sells has analyzed the Al-Qaeda vision as an attempt to turn war and death into ritual, and not just a strategy to achieve intelligible goals. For Al-Qaeda, Islam has been terribly compromised by Muslim alliances with infidel and apostate powers, and martyrdom, death for God, becomes an end in itself to restore the integrity of religion. The point is that destruction of self, tuhlaka, is to be preferred over humiliation before God, ihana, in echo of the adulterer earlier mentioned. In fact, this is playing off a Quranic verse which they interpret to mean that the true tuhlaka, the true destruction, that you'll face is in the next world if you don't put your own life at risk in this one. Putting your own life at risk is kind of ritualized. So the acts of al-Qaeda have resonated. They have resonated, at least temporarily, in some Muslim circles. We should admit that, as symbols of defiance against the world's tyrants. But once the titillation passes, al-Qaeda is left with no real Sharia grounds to stand on. And I think, as David mentioned before, this is one reason why the Sunni community is starting to turn against it. Martyrdom in Sunni Islam does not exist for the sake of communal atonement, that is, as a means to bring the community closer to God. There are other means to achieve this goal. And so Sunni authorities, while recognizing a certain kind of martyrdom, have not given their imprimatur to al-Qaeda and its type of death for God, specifically martyrdom operations that do not clearly serve the interest of Muslims, such as suicide attacks beyond the abode of Islam. So the point of all of this is that there are theological grounds and not only practical reasons for rejecting certain kinds of martyrdom. And I don't mean me or academics, but communities themselves thinking theologically and not only about practical reasons. A community has its own logic of what makes a true martyr and what makes a false one. Following this logic can help make sense of the forces of martyrdom today and even help us, who knows, predict which ones will persist and which ones will not. In today's world, where different traditions interact pluralistically, there can be acute tensions between the demand for religious purity and the worldly interests of the believing community amidst a globalized reality. Traditional Sunni discussions speak of many kinds of martyrs, including those who do not die a violent death. The preponderant position, traditionally, is that someone who dies a violent death can only really be considered a true martyr if killed unjustly while defending rational interests, his own life, property, other humans, both Muslims and dhimmis. If someone seeks a violent death out of fear for religion, out of the concern for the integrity of the religion itself, somehow as a way to establish the religion once again, the Hora Jism is the term that they use, this is not a valid martyrdom. But martyrdom pursued for a strategic interest is another question where rational calculations come into play. And I would say the question in today's circumstances, and it's been begun to be responded to, is this: is martyrdom in Muslim interests at this globalized moment? And finally, I would just add that Islam itself has a rich theological tradition to make sense of these traditions without prejudice to the community's concern for its own standing before God. Thank you very much.